Muy buenas tardes a todos. Vamos a empezar con la segunda conferencia magistral, posterior a la conferencia inaugural de los doctores Gustavo Garza y Marta Steingart. Va a ser la conferencia en inglés, como se anunció desde un principio. Por favor, los que gusten hacer las preguntas por escrito son bienvenidos a hacerlas desde antes. Pero si no, también lo trataremos de traducir entre todos los compañeros. I was telling them, Michael, that the conference will be in English, as we agree. And I think that it's very important that we are going to be like discussing between Spanish and English, and the questions that they can ask, I can translate it, and they can ask you in writing or something like that.
Okay.
Okay? So I'm going to introduce you first in Spanish to the rest of the audience, and then we can start with the conference, and I tell you. Bueno, el profesor Michael Leaf, le agradecemos mucho su participación en el coloquio. Es profesor investigador de la Universidad de British Columbia en la School of Community and Regional Planning. El doctor Michael Leaf también forma parte del Centro de Estudios para el Sudeste Asiático en la Universidad de British Columbia y tiene su bachelor en arquitectura en el MIT. Y tiene una maestría en arquitectura también por la Universidad de California en Berkeley, una maestría en City and Regional Planning por la Universidad de California en Berkeley, y tiene su doctorado en City and Regional Planning también en la Universidad de California en Berkeley. El título de la disertación de su tesis doctoral, y que definió en gran parte la investigación que hace el doctor Leaf a futuro, se llama Land Regulation and Housing Development in Jakarta, in Indonesia, from the Big Village to the Modern City. Y su director fue David Dowell, el que le dirigió la tesis doctoral. El doctor Leaf ha trabajado, y esa fue parte de la invitación, de que ha trabajado sobre todo temas tanto ambientales, como urbanos, como de desarrollo urbano, y en alguna medida también sobre la tenencia de la tierra y los problemas de la tierra en el sudeste asiático. Y se nos hacía importante a los alumnos del doctorado en estudios urbanos de tener a veces una perspectiva comparada, un poco fuera de los estudios latinoamericanos, y sobre todo dentro de la literatura internacional, a veces qué parámetros podríamos tomar y qué parámetros no. Entonces, para Michael Leaf, it's a big challenge for you, this presentation, because when I told him all the different backgrounds of the students from the different universities, from 23 different universities, and students from the master's degree, the PhD, and from all around Mexico, it was like very difficult because we have like these different disciplines, urban economics, sociology, urban sociology, and all this like variety of the urban studies. So when he asked me like, well, what do you want me to present? I said, well, it's complicated, whatever you want, but you need to be aware that all the students are from different backgrounds, and it's important for us that you are here with us. El profesor Michael Leaf también enseña en la Universidad de British Columbia, yo creo que 3 cursos muy interesantes, uno de ellos que se llama Planning for an Urban World, en el que se ve precisamente eso en esa materia, ¿no? O sea, sobre la provisión de los servicios públicos, las infraestructuras, y qué podría diferenciar a una ciudad de otra, y qué podría entonces hablarnos de, sobre todo de qué podría, o sea, el focus de esa materia es, a final de cuentas, tener una perspectiva comparada y una visión general de cómo se van construyendo las diferentes infraestructuras, las diferentes provisiones de servicios públicos en sociedades completamente diferentes, y encontrar en algunas de ellas un hilo conductor. Entonces, en parte, la presentación del doctor Leaf va a ser un reto intelectual a eso, tanto para su formación y su presentación con todos nosotros, sobre todo que no trabaja muchos temas de América Latina, pero sí sobre qué podrían constituir algunos conceptos y cómo hacerlos comparables históricamente y en diferentes sociedades. So, Michael, it's for me personally an honor that you are here with us, and also for all the students of the PhD in Urban and Environmental Studies at el Colegio de México. And you have around 30-45 minutes for your presentation. Va a ser una presentación sin diapositivas en la que se le va a tratar de poner mucho más el interés hacia una discusión teórica ¿no? Hacia los estudiantes. Entonces esperamos que va a tratar de hablar lo más despacio que se pueda en inglés para que lo entienda toda la audiencia y damos bienvenidos. No, se avisó en inglés. The microphone is yours.
Okay, thank you. And I would like to thank Armando for the invitation to join you today. It's certainly an honor to be here. And I want to apologize for not being able to speak Spanish, but Armando assures me that you all understand English, so I will try to I will try to speak slowly and enunciate clearly as best as I can. And I will try to stick to the writing I've done. If I speak just from notes, my tendency is to go off on tangents. Armando knows this from classes where I'll talk for about an hour and a half and maybe not make any sense whatsoever. So I will try to stick to my talk. But if I'm speaking too fast or if there are questions, I can please let me know and I'll see if I can adjust. And there will be time for questions at the end. Oh, I think Armando has said that already. So the title of my talk is Urbanization, Development, and the Parameters of Difference. Sorry. I would like to preface my talk today by describing a bit about my own background. My purpose in doing this is to both give you a bit more of an introduction to who I am, but as well so that you will understand my own positionality. This is a term anthropologists use to emphasize how one's interpretation or understanding of a thing or a situation is shaped by one's own subjectivity, or in other words, that the perspective one brings to a situation is determined to one extent or another by who one is, by one's past experiences, as well as one's relationship to the thing one is observing. You can only see the world through your own eyes, and thus it is important to be aware of your own limits, your own habits, and biases. That is, the things that shape your own analytical propensities, your own sense of theory. In my case, I grew up in a small town in America and did not have much exposure to big cities until I was 17 and went off to Boston to go to college. For me, this first encounter with the big city was daunting. The sheer size of the city was just overwhelming. In order to get a handle on it all, I spent a lot of time walking, often for hours at a time, sometimes with specific destinations in mind, but mostly just wandering aimlessly, soaking it all in. I know now in retrospect that I don't really feel I understand a city or understand the spatial relationships between things in that city until I have traversed it on foot. I think I need to be close to something, to touch it, to smell it, to see the sunlight reflect off it before I'm able to appreciate it for what it is. And this seems to be as true for how I engage with cities as it was for how I came to understand the forests and farmlands around the home in which I grew up. There were parts of Boston that seemed familiar to me, familiar yet foreign. Sometimes the older residential neighborhoods further out looked not all that different from parts of my own small town, some 300 miles inland to the west. But in my hometown, I could walk from where I lived on the edge of town and be in the heart of Main Street, right near the county courthouse, in about 15 minutes. In Boston, the neighborhoods would just go on, and I would keep walking. And then the building forms would change, from simple 3-story wood frame houses to solidly built brick apartment buildings, unlike anything in my own hometown. And eventually these two would be supplanted by other landscapes, maybe train tracks and warehouses with old industrial buildings nearby, or maybe graffiti-covered, trash-strewn public housing projects for impoverished families, or perhaps commercial districts, huge commercial districts, different from any I had seen before, with streets crammed with cars that never seemed to stop honking or to stop moving, even at red lights, and shops full of things from everywhere on earth being sold by people from everywhere on earth. So many people speaking with such strange accents, and I don't just mean the native Bostonians, for Boston seemed to be a sort of people magnet, attracting immigrants from everywhere one could imagine. For a kid just arrived from a small town, Boston was a window on the world, or maybe it was the world, the whole world in microcosm. For me, simply being in Boston was a wholly engaging experience. It is a place that is central to the origin myths of the nation I grew up in, and thus had meaning for me even before I had arrived there. I came to understand that it was also expressive of a particular genius loci, a spirit of place, where the North American continent is hit by the cold waters of the North Atlantic, where the late summers are hot and humid and the tar softens on the road beneath your feet until the air begins to cool and the leaves on the trees change color and the cool autumn air gives way to the snow of winter, and then the winds shift in late January, bringing freezing rains in off the ocean, covering the whole city with a thick shell of ice until the springtime thaw. The city, as I came to understand it, is thus layered with multiple meanings, a product of local geography and climate combined with a perpetually evolving history, a history of sometimes major events, and at other times events that are largely forgotten, even if consequential nonetheless. A city is an outcome of specific political economies, a landscape shaped by periods of investment and disinvestment, and the rising and falling fortunes of municipal leaders and those who aspire to be municipal leaders. Ultimately, I came to understand that a city is the built expression of social relations, power and money rendered in concrete form, whether accreted gradually by many actors over centuries or conceived, designed, financed, and built in a single grand project at one time. I mention all this to stress that I came to the study of cities as an outsider to cities. The experience of someone looking in from the outside, from outside a place or a society or a culture, will necessarily be different from that of someone within. Boston was my first encounter with the city and with the urban world, but it has certainly not been the last. After I graduated from college, I went to travel in Southeast Asia and had other encounters with other cities, but things were different. Kuala Lumpur was not Boston. And the lessons I learned, the explanations I had come to understand about why Boston was the way it was, did not necessarily apply in other contexts. So graduate school meant not only more urban studies, but Asian studies as well. My doctoral dissertation was an attempt to understand not only how the city of Jakarta was being transformed by developers, but also how the regulatory system supposedly intended for the government to control the actions of developers was in actuality being manipulated so that the major players were able to use the system to their advantage, supplanting smaller companies and undermining the bargaining power of small landowners. Since that time, I have continued to be fascinated by how cities in Asia form, expand, and evolve. And I have been fortunate to have been involved in projects over the years focusing on urbanization, not only in Indonesia, but China and Vietnam as well. These research interests carry forward into my teaching, as the courses I offer deal with international development, comparative urbanization, and the societal and institutional shifts that accompany urbanization and development. Because my students at UBC comprise a mix of Canadians and Americans who wish to work in developing countries, as well as students from developing countries, we tend to spend quite a bit of time discussing what I have come to think of over the years as the parameters of difference. What differentiates a society in the developed world from one in the developing world? If I make a statement that corruption is systemic in Indonesia or that Indonesia's politics are based on highly clientelistic relationships, this is not to imply that there is no corruption or clientelism in Canada, but the question is always there. How and why is Canada different from Indonesia? Is Canadian corruption somehow different from Indonesian corruption, for example? These sorts of issues, these parameters of difference, are bound up in the terminology we use or choose not to use, and no matter what, these terms for indicating difference are always problematic. At my university, the titles of the courses we offer need to be approved by a university committee, and for years I've tried to use the now archaic term third world in the titles of my courses, always to have them come back from this committee corrected to some version of developing country. I have chosen to persist with the term third world, a term that grew out of the Cold War era and carried with it very distinct political implications about post-colonial independence, specifically because people challenge me about it. I think any large categorical distinction about the parameters of difference in the world today should be an issue for debate, a point of departure for discussing how difference is manifested both between and within nations. So my persistence in using the term third world is meant to be both provisional and provocative. In contrast, I am bothered by the terminology of developed and developing countries, specifically because people do not challenge these terms, which is shocking, I think, as these two categories so neatly and yet so arbitrarily divide up the hundreds of diverse nations on Earth. So in my classes over the years, I've been seeking the proper terminology for expressing these parameters of difference. One possibility is to use terms like South and North, or Global South and Global North, though not every southern country is developing, nor every northern country developed. Another possibility is to use the term majority world to emphasize how the developed countries of the world today are in the minority when looked at in terms of the total population. Though for some reason people in the minority world tend to forget that they are the minority, or the exception in the world today. To some degree, I have fallen into the habit of using the terms rich world and poor world, though as we shall see, these categories are increasingly problematic as well. After worrying about these terms for years and being told repeatedly by my university that third world is no longer an acceptable category for expressing difference, I recently discovered what the new term is while I was reading the business pages of the newspaper. I now know that the acceptable term is emerging economies. Developing countries are no longer developing, they are emerging, like a butterfly from a chrysalis. They are no longer countries or societies, but instead they are stripped to their essential functions of economic production and consumption as emerging economies, or even more pointedly as emerging markets. This then is the preferred term from the perspective of global capitalism. I'm being facetious, of course, though only partially so. In reading the business pages, one can get a sense of just how much faith investors have in the emerging markets for saving capitalism. Or to put it differently, that these new markets provide the basis for continued global economic growth into the future, since capitalism as a system requires continual growth in order to be viable. This observation, that it is the erstwhile developing countries, the emerging markets, that will provide the basis for capitalism's future, has critical implications for thinking about the urban futures in these countries. So, getting to the subject of my talk, I would like to start today with a basic observation and then discuss some of the implications and ideas that this conjures up. A standard data source on urbanization, which is online, free, readily accessible, and easy to use, is the United Nations World Urbanization Prospects, which compiles and reports figures on population change and urbanization as taken from national level sources in UN member nations. Whenever this database is updated, researchers produce new papers summarizing global trends in urbanization. This observation is a quote from one of the more recent of such papers by Barney Cohen. And then here's the quote. "The level of world urbanization today and the number and size of the world's largest cities are unprecedented. At the beginning of the 20th century, just 16 cities in the world, the vast majority in advanced industrial countries, contained 1 million or more people. Today there are almost 400 cities. Today almost 400 cities contain 1 million people or more, and about 70% of them are found in the developing world." What do we make of this? One could say that there are two basic conditions emphasized by this statement. First, that the overall numbers of million-plus cities has shifted tremendously in the course of 1 century, more than 20-fold from 16 to 400. And that since the overall sizes of the largest of these cities are considerably larger than anything previously experienced in human history, the total numbers of people living in these 400 million-plus cities truly are unprecedented. It's hard to imagine there is any turning back from our planet's urban future. The second point that this emphasizes is the shift from urbanization in large cities being phenomena of rich world or developed societies to becoming characteristics of the poor world or developing societies. And here I would add in a couple more observations from Cohen's paper in order to emphasize where this is headed. Over the next 30 years, virtually all of the world's population growth is expected to be concentrated in urban areas in the developing world. So even with this recent rapid growth whereby, in absolute terms, the numbers of urban dwellers almost quadrupled between 1950 and 2000, going from 733 million to 2.857 billion, at current rates of growth, the world's urban population can be expected to double in only 38 years. So that by 2030, demographers predict that the world's urban population will be approaching 5 billion. So what happened? And more importantly, what's going to happen? If at the outset of your careers as urban scholars and planners, you think problems arising from rapid and large-scale urbanization are already tremendous and unprecedented, over the course of your working lives, the underlying conditions leading to such problems will only continue to worsen or continue to increase. And even though the rates of increase have already slowed down, the absolute numbers will will nonetheless be very high, 2 billion more dwellers in little more than just a couple of decades. For the developing urbanizing countries of Asia, where my research is focused, the impacts will be tremendous. For example, in Indonesia, where only 12% of the population, or 10 million people, were urban in 1950, this means a shift from about 120 million urban dwellers today, that is 50% of the total population, to 180 million by 2030, that's 63% of the total, and 210 million, or 72% of the total, by 2050. So in other words, 90 million more people will be living in Indonesian cities in another 3.5 decades. Most of this growth will happen in the developing countries of Asia and Africa, as these are the parts of the world that were furthest behind in the onset of their urban transitions. In comparison to Asia and Africa, there was a shorter delay in the start of Latin America's urban transition, so that as a region, its urbanization is already quite advanced. Mexico, for example, already has about 79% of its population living in cities, meaning a total of close to 90 million urban dwellers. This number, however, is projected to grow to close to 125 million, or 86% of the total, by 2050. So another 35 million people will be added to Mexico's urban population over your working lives. Still a large and rapid increase, even though the annual urban growth rate for the country peaked in the late 1950s. And in contrast, Mexico's rural population, as is happening seemingly everywhere in the world, will continue to shrink from 25 million to about 20 million over the same period. And what basis do we have for understanding or anticipating this future? Do our current notions of urbanity, or what it means to live in a city, give us any clue to what urban life will be like in the future, even the near future of just a couple of decades away? Here I would like to speculate and sketch out some ideas for a possible urban future, though this particular vision or model or framework or conjecture might not be entirely accurate. To set the groundwork for this, let's first get back to the what happened question. One might summarize this hugely complex issue by describing the million-plus city of a century ago as deriving first and foremost from economic processes of industrialization. In fact, to push this even further, one could see these cities as being reformed or improved versions of the 19th century industrial city. That is, the outcome of the first major wave of urbanization in modern times. Urbanization driven by rapid advances in technologies and practices of industrial manufacturing, which had the effect of increasing efficiencies of production, thus enhancing the wealth-producing capacity of the city. In contrast, how do we think about the present wave of urbanization, the one that has led to the 400 million plus cities and the prospect of another 2 billion urban dwellers in the next couple of decades? Is this an instance of diffusion? Perhaps institutional diffusion as well as technological and economic, with something that happened first in the cities of what is now the rich world that then spread to the rest of the world. And in this, do we see a particular way of understanding development? The conventional division of the world into developed and developing components carries an implicit assumption that something called development can be invoked to pull developing societies or economies into the category of developed societies or economies. But we know that current processes of industrial expansion, rapid as they are nonetheless an insufficient basis for replicating urbanization along the lines of the industrial city of the 19th century. Even accepting the idea of the rich world economies moving on beyond manufacturing, or what economists call secondary production, to tertiary service industries or even quaternary information economies, there's still not enough manufacturing in the conventional sense to support an industrial basis for the future growth of the cities of today's developing world. So, what happened? Why are the cities of the developing world different in such a basic economic sense from what came before, and which, objectively speaking, provides us with the only tangible modern urban experience that we can use for comparison? One possible, though somewhat vague, explanation lies in the preceding histories of these cities, particularly those in the post-colonial or recently decolonized world. Briefly stated, the argument is that despite the advent of the urban transition in what is now the rich world, the politics and practices of colonial rule, over the 19th and early 20th centuries especially, suppressed urbanization by emphasizing maximization of primary production of the raw inputs into European industrialization. Farming, mining, resource extraction of various sorts, all conventionally rural activities, activities which created incentives for traditional large families. The resulting growth in family sizes triggered a population boom and set the stage for eventual rapid urbanization, beginning with cityward movement at the time of independence or decolonization for many former colonies in Asia and Africa following the end of World War II, which not incidentally is also understood as the beginning of the era of development. Another, also admittedly rather vague explanation of this current urbanization boom lies in the practice of development itself, particularly and somewhat ironically, the long-standing emphasis on rural development, in that even the most successful efforts at rural development, or especially the successful ones, can be seen to induce urbanization. New rural infrastructure, new roads and bridges, facilitate the movement of people from farms to cities and back again, since much of this migration starts off as circular movement between rural and urban and back to rural again. And new skills creation, following upon the expansion and improvement of rural education and training, prepare the rural peasants or soon-to-be ex-peasants for living in the more challenging social and economic settings of the city. And then there are the effects of the Green Revolution. One would expect that a multifold increase in agricultural output would have the effect of improving the livelihoods of farmers in the countryside, which it did, but then efficiency gains through new technologies and new varieties of crop also had the effect of making large components of the agricultural workforce redundant. Coupled with the restructuring of ownership in the countryside, increasing numbers of erstwhile rural dwellers began to seek out new opportunities in the cities. So, for want of a better term, we might say that the transformation that the first quote of Cohen refers to is a shift from a conventional understanding of the industrial city to a largely unknown condition of the city of development, or maybe the city that the era of development created, or maybe one might emphasize another aspect of this history to stress the post-colonial context of this type of urbanism. What else is happening alongside this that might help us understand the nature of the emergent city of development, the third world city, or maybe the post-third world city might be the best term for it? Turning back to the histories of rich world cities, we could focus on issues of social class formation and change over this past century. Perhaps most importantly, we would see the, again, historically unprecedented rise and then full efflorescence of the middle classes, which, despite Marx's conjectures about the revolutionary potential of the urban proletariat, provided the resolution to the problem of the industrial city as understood by people like Charles Dickens or Friedrich Engels. Arguably, it was the rise of trade unionism and the middle-class workforce that resulted from this, which offset the pressures of urban radicalism in which Marx saw so much revolutionary potential. The urban middle classes were thus more than an economic force, but a political force as well, with increasing political voice in the context of democratizing polities of the 20th century. So one could argue that it was the rise of the middle classes in the context of industrial urbanization during what may be seen as the first phase of the urban transition in what is now the rich world, which undermined the revolutionary potential of the urban proletariat that Marx had predicted. But then, where are we now? Possibly into the withering stage of the middle classes in the rich world industrial or post-industrial societies? The decline of the middle classes in the US, for example, is something that economists have been aware of and tracking for at least the past 3 decades. This is only now becoming a major political issue, however, as people begin to understand that for the first time in American history, the economic circumstances of the current generation will be worse than that of their parents. This is contrary to the notion of the American dream, which has always provided a promise of continual improvement into the future, and it is one major reason why American politics are so divisive at the moment. Is it meaningful that this decline of the middle classes is occurring as other nations in the presumably poor world see the expansion of their own middle classes? India's middle class, for example, is now larger than the total population of the United States. What are the possible outcomes of these two seemingly contravening trends? Might we envision a world where the primary fissures between rich and poor are no longer between nations or societies, but within them? This may be a challenging concept to consider, since the whole discourse of development in the world has been tied to the idea of the nation-state as the basic unit of analysis, or in other words, as constituting the parameters of difference. In the future, however, the conceptual distinction between developed and developing countries might not make as much sense anymore as differences within countries. It's been said, for example, that even now, if Shanghai could be carved out of China and given independence, it would be classified as a developed country, in contrast to the developing country of China left behind. What will this mean for our cities? Will spatial polarization by city or by neighborhood within city be an increasingly important characteristic in both what are now developing and developed countries? Is this one possible form of convergence between the rich world and the poor world of today, that both will contain polarized fragments of wealth and poverty within their own metropolitan regions? The urban spatial aspects of socioeconomic polarization is a theme which has been gaining attention in recent years in both developed and developing country contexts, as, for example, with the idea of splintering urbanism by Graham and Marvin, which argues that the new technologies of infrastructure provision are increasingly segregating urban areas into rich and poor territories. And coming from the airport last night, we drove on Carlos Slim's new highway, which is a perfect example of that, avoiding the traffic in the rest of the lower level traffic in Mexico City. It's worth paying money for, I suppose. And when we consider the overall spatial implications of this ongoing urban transition, it is striking how little research attention this has attracted, despite how seemingly important this is at both local and global levels. One important exception is the highly quantitative research that Shlomo Angel and his colleagues have carried out over the past decade or so. To very briefly summarize their findings based on data and projection on close to 4,000 cities worldwide over this period that I have been discussing, whereby the world's urban population will more or less double in 38 years, the territories covered by urbanization will essentially triple. 3 times the current amount of urban space on the planet will be covered by the expansion of urban areas over less than 4 decades. Again, a historically unprecedented circumstance, and one that is actually quite hard to understand, hard to comprehend. The tripling of the territory of cities over our lifetimes. The reason for this is that despite the current obsession in the urbanized rich world in planning for compact cities, the principal means by which global urban growth is occurring and will continue to occur is not through planning, but through self-help processes in what is labeled as informal urbanism. In aggregate, and despite the often constrained space of the informally built city, this is a very low-density form of urbanization compared to the densities of conventionally planned city building. An emergent research theme that addresses these processes and forms of the ongoing urban transition is what is now called peri-urbanization, a relatively new term compared to conventional notions of suburbanization as the means by which cities grow outward into the countryside. Differentiating between suburbanization and peri-urbanization appears as a complex and unresolved issue when one looks at the planning literature overall, but I would characterize the difference as being a distinction between the outward growth of cities into the surrounding countryside, that is, the way we think of suburbanization, and the interpenetration between rural and urban over what are often immense territories. Such peri-urbanization is especially prevalent in Asian contexts, as high pre-existing rural populations, as associated with wet rice agriculture, for example, can facilitate very rapid urbanization in place. A form of city building that 2 decades ago urban geographer Terry McGee labeled as the desa kota, a term which combines Indonesian words for village and city, following his analysis of this phenomenon in Java. Such considerations of the ongoing urban transition also, to me at least, raise the question of standards, and thus how we think about planning. I had mentioned before the implied assumptions from conventional notions of development, that it is the position and duty of the rich world nations to lift those of the poor world out of their poverty. And this is very much a post-colonial echo of past history, the civilizing mission of colonialism. But this also presupposes that it is the rich world, or more precisely, the urbanization experiences of the rich world, which set out standards for the aspiring developing world. Such standards of urbanization cut across the various and widely varying aspects of what it means to be urban. From different types of technical infrastructure, water supply, roads, communications, and so forth, to practices of economic production and business, including the nature and practices of consumption, to ideas about cultural production and consumption, that is, the culture of cities. Even this has standards. This question of standards is of repeated relevance whenever we discuss issues of infrastructure, certainly, as anyone working in this field is constantly confronted with the notion that the necessities of city building or urban construction cannot possibly keep pace with the demographic expansion of the city, as if the fundamental process issue was merely that of things speeding up, that it is the rate of change which differentiates today's urbanization from what came before, rather than the possibility that the fundamental basis of urban life may have changed. But in contrast to this conventional assumption, we might also consider how so much of the taken-for-granted standards in our rich world cities, and increasingly in the richer components of the rest of the world, might more rightly be seen as historic aberrations when compared against the long history of urbanization in the world. We should perhaps consider ourselves lucky to have lived during a period when access to cheap energy supplies allow us to live such lives of urban luxury, where merely the soft pressure of one's finger on a plastic switch brings light and warmth into our homes. Homes which in Canada and the US, at least, on average, actually have more separate bedrooms than people to sleep in them. And when leaving these homes, people are able to travel around at great rates of speed in personalized individual vehicles, which don't even require large animals or slaves to move them. Could the kings of ancient time even have imagined such things? The point here is that maybe instead of thinking that development is about bringing the poor world up to the standards of the rich world, there might be some value in rethinking standards which can accommodate the entire world. Though perhaps this is wishful thinking, considering the Pandora's box of cultural globalization. By focusing on standards, we are necessarily questioning the implicit assumption that rich world standards should be accepted as global standards. To challenge this assumption is, of course, also problematic, as it is seen to imply different standards for rich and poor in the world, a condition that is seen to accept, if not promote, inequity and entrench uneven development. And one could point to the history of what was once labeled appropriate technology in regard for such criticisms. And whatever happened to appropriate technology anyway? Does anyone read E.F. Schumacher anymore? Is there a wheel here to be reinvented? Do people know who E.F. Schumacher was? Or the book Small is Beautiful? Oh, there's a generational difference, I think. I think the new generation needs to read it, and I'm sure it's already translated into most of the major languages of the world. It must be in Spanish. So a book recommendation, among others. By rethinking fundamental standards underlying urbanization, we are not just dealing with infrastructure, but space as well. The use of space, the densities, but also the way space is occupied. That is, getting into the contentious area of who is allowed to be where and allowed by whom. One might see this as an issue of property rights, which it is, but to me it also seems that there is a particular level of abstraction in defining these issues purely in terms of rights as expressed in impersonal laws. In practice, there are more often than not deeply entrenched sociological and political components to this as well, with such potentially extra-legal aspects of urbanization of greater importance in locales where property rights per se are more ambiguous. Consideration of the dualism between the formal planned city and the informal unplanned city also prompts the observation that planning as conventionally practiced is actually part of the problem rather than the solution. In this, we see that the role of planning is not just as a technical undertaking, but an expression of state-society relations more broadly. For that matter, there's also the question of how and where planning engages with market forces, and the argument that planning has evolved from being a largely statist exercise to one which is increasingly corporate or privatized. This situation presents further challenges for adapting planning to such new and unprecedented circumstances. Basically, what can planning be in the informal city, the city that will emerge out of peri-urbanization over the next few decades? Can we talk about the unplanned informal city as an instance of auto-organization? That it will have the structure and coherence, despite a lack of planning as conventionally understood? Or would holding to this perspective be essentially just an abrogation of responsibility, particularly state responsibility? Is there an intrinsic order to the unplanned? It's not an area of urban studies that I've so far had much interest or faith in, but I've recently come across what is now being promoted as urban science, a mostly mathematical approach that seems to be able to find order in the complex messiness of the unplanned city. Here's a quote from Michael Batty, one such thinker along these lines, who has brought fractal geometry into the study of urbanization and urban form. He writes, "We have only just started in earnest to build theories of how cities function as complex systems. We do know, however, that idealized geometric plans produced without any regard to urban functioning," which is his description of urban planning, "are not likely to resolve any of our current urban ills, and this new physics makes us much more aware of the limits of planning. It is likely to lead to a view that as we learn more about the functioning of such complex systems, we will interfere less but in more appropriate ways." This seems to me to be a startling insight from a mathematician. Well, actually, he's a geographer and mathematician. Considering that over the decades in the developed world, we have moved away from the all-encompassing master plan toward a more contingent approaches such as strategic planning, and for example, there is no master plan in Vancouver, the idea of interfering less but in more appropriate ways already seems to make sense, even before we think about the speed and scale of urban change over the next few decades. Though the idea that less intervention may be more effective seems counterintuitive, perhaps it can give us some clues for how to deal with global urbanization over the coming decades. The dilemma here is that we seemingly need a new paradigm for addressing these complex interconnecting issues. I would contend that the practice of urban planning is today organized through a modernist paradigm, as it has been for the past century. Key to this is the understanding that the principal means by which the creation of urban space and the provision of goods and services occur is through the capitalist market economy, and that this is seen as the proper or even the best way to build and maintain cities. One could argue that it is this dominance of capitalist relations that, for example, underlies the current trend toward privatization of planning. Or as another implication, that this is why the popular city of self-help provisioning is defined in the negative, that is, in terms of what it is not, as being informal or irregular. But clearly conditions have changed and continue to change, and it is apparent that capitalism as we know it today is insufficient for accommodating the totality of global urbanization. And because capitalism cannot encompass the entire urban world, this is why formal planning, that is, the planning practice of the modernist paradigm, is in many instances retreating into the exclusionary practices of the private corporate sector, even going so far in some cases to establish what have been called private governments to administer developer-built residential enclaves. One might also surmise that it is because of these limits to capitalist urbanization that the popular city of self-help continues to be defined in the negative. Although I can point out limitations to the old paradigm, I am not in a position to lay out a wholly new paradigm, as in fact I don't think any one person can. Instead, I think this will emerge collectively out of the practice of planning, but planning practice that engages the entirety of the emergent urban world, not just the formal city of the elites, but the popular city of the rest. Such engagement must be on their terms, however, as planning must be understood to be advantageous to the marginalized, the disenfranchised, those who are currently excluded from formal urbanism, in order for it to be effective. But I don't think we as yet even have a language for discussing how to do this. Instead, the means we have at hand for planning our cities are still derived from past experiences. So there is a heavy weight of path dependency here that we must either work with or otherwise overcome. And by we, here I mean humans in general, not just the professional city builders, as so much of the emergent urban environment is being built by non-professionals, the peri-urban citizens of our urban future. Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I think that you challenge also the idea of the planning. You give some relevant facts about the growth of the population, but the growth of the cities is bigger than the growth of the population to triple even the size of the actual cities in the world. And I think it's a big challenge for all the planning students here and for all the planners for the future. Apparently, we have a lot of work to do. I hope so, if things don't change. And I'm going to proceed with the questions from the audience. And hay micrófono, ahí está. Entonces pasamos a una sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Yo creo que nos da elementos muy interesantes, ¿no? Mientras que la población se duplica en los próximos años, el tamaño de las ciudades se triplica, la manera en que las ciudades se planean, pues en la mayoría son no planeadas, y que también el rol de los planificadores urbanos y de los urbanistas hacia el futuro pues está cuestionado desde los paradigmas de los que trabajamos y desde el ideal moderno de la ciudad también hacia el futuro, ¿no? Entonces yo creo que nos abre una serie más que de respuestas, de interrogantes. You, instead of giving us answers, you are giving us more questions for the future. So I think that's stimulating for us. Y las preguntas, por favor. If someone
I'm Victor Magaña from UNAM, from the National University of Mexico. And what I have in mind is the case of Mexico City. And it's I'm not sure about the numbers, but I think it's about 1/4 of the population of the entire country living in one particular area. And we are talking about planning or not planning, but can we think of something like restructuring what we all have already done? Like, for instance, in the US, can you think of something like the model followed in the development of the cities? It was probably not the right model, or is not the right model. Can we think of a way of going back and rethinking or considering some elements that could help us to redefine what we are doing with this space? And I'm thinking in the case of Mexico City, I mean, what can we do, or are we doomed, I don't know if that is the right word, for the following decades just to live in a chaotic environment, as I consider Mexico City is? If I made myself clear.
Yeah, I think one of the problems, or I tend to think of urban differences in the world as linked to a society's position in its urban transition. That is, and one point about the urban transition, well, I think you all, well, a quick definition of the urban transition is a shift from a society being largely rural, and for most of human history, for most of urban history, cities have been about 10% of society's population. So societies have tended to be 90% rural, and this is shifting quite dramatically with the onset of the urban transition a couple of centuries ago. But the speed of change is largely a function of that, where a country is in that shift. So my perspective is very much colored by work in Asia, which Indonesia, as I had explained, had gone from 10% urban to 50% urban, and will continue to increase. And the numbers are just so overwhelming that I don't think planners have the luxury of going back and correcting things from the past. But what's happening in terms of the urban transition elsewhere in the world, I think, is quite interesting. In fact, well, here I would bring in the concept of the demographic transition as well, that I see the demographic transition is a shift from societies that have high growth rates, high birth rates and high death rates, which is traditional society, to societies that have lower death rates and lower birth rates, like the so-called developed world. There seem to be parallels between the demographic transition and urban transitions. But what's happening, or what's what's happened in the rich world is the demographic transitions and the urban transitions have gotten to the point where without migration, if Western Europe and US and Australia and Japan and so forth, the rich countries of the world, if they didn't allow migration into the country, they would have decreasing populations. So I think there are now demographers who work on Europe in particular who talk about the second demographic transition, which is declining populations. I think this is a very fascinating and complex issue because it links into a lot of the problems of migration around the world and a lot of discussion of migration. So this issue of stepping back and correcting things from the past, some countries do have that, or some cities do have that possibility. I keep thinking of Detroit as I'm saying this, that a city with a declining population certainly not only can go back and change the basic structures, but I think in Detroit's case, they're rather forced to do that. An interesting situation is the country of Japan, which is, without immigrants coming in, they would have a declining population. They are a country which is, at the national level, they have an anti-immigrant policy. I think many countries have an anti-immigrant policy in a de facto sense, but Japan specifically does not want to risk destroying Japanese culture by allowing foreigners in large numbers to live in Japan. And I've seen presentations from planners discussing what Tokyo will be like with a 10% decline in the population, 20% decline. At 30%, they start daylighting streams and they bring organic agriculture into the center of Tokyo. It's quite fascinating to have these. So I guess the point is all of this sort of discussion is always linked to the numbers, the question of the numbers of people and the growth rate of cities and of urban societies in general.
Tenemos otra pregunta aquí adelante, por favor. Si se presentan primero y de dónde vienen para presentarse con el doctor.
Teresa Vázquez de la Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez. Hi, Michael.
Hello.
Pues muchas gracias por la crítica del concepto de desarrollo. Thank you for the critique of the concept of development. Y yo quisiera preguntarte acerca de la cuestión del concepto de desarrollo, cómo se vincula también con el concepto o con los procesos de urbanización. I would like to ask you about the concept of development and how it's linked to the process of urbanization. Porque en la cuestión de todas las cuestiones de desarrollo siempre se pone como está desarrollado, está urbanizado, ¿sí? Because during the discussions or all the discourses on development, they always include like something is, a country is developed because it's urbanized. Y lo que tú estás haciendo es cuestionar ese concepto de desarrollo. Y entonces lo que yo veo es que tú también estás cuestionando el concepto de urbanización. And what you're doing in your presentation is questioning this idea of development. You know, I think that Arturo Escobar also did that for Latin America. But and if you are criticizing that concept, then I see that you're also questioning the concept of urbanization itself. And I would like to see if you're questioning this path of development along with this path of urbanization, what does it mean? From this questioning, there's the possibility of shaping or discussing a new path, I don't know. Y lo que le estoy preguntando es que como él está cuestionando esta cuestión de desarrollo que siempre se vincula con la cuestión de urbanización, entonces pareciera que él está cuestionando el concepto mismo, la posibilidad del urbano, entonces se abría otra vía posible, ¿no?
An easy question. I think the unfortunate situation is we approach any new thing with an understanding based on past history. And the notions of cities are based on the experience of what is now the developed country cities, the cities that started with an industrial base and have gone on to service economies and now the knowledge economy and so forth. And yet this sort of economic ratcheting up might be one way of describing it. The sort of economic trajectory of what is the rich world, I don't think applies to the simply because of the numbers. Well, not simply, but largely because of the numbers of people building the informal cities. So I don't think we even have a way of thinking about urbanization into the future. So yes, I don't have a choice but to question what urbanization means, because I don't think we know what the future of urbanization is. Will it go by another name?
That's a challenge, right?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned in my talk this term desakota, which it was a term. Terry McGee is one of my colleagues at UBC. He's actually one of the main reasons I'm at UBC. He worked on Indonesia, and the island of Java has about 110 million people, or at the time he was doing the research on Java, it was about 110 million people on one fairly small island. And the rural population density in Java is higher than urban population densities in the western part of the United States. In the low density cities are so when the island of Java could arguably be considered one big city already, depending on how you, well, it's very problematic how to define a city, and yet it's still rural production, but he was finding very huge territories around the outskirts of what are very much considered urban areas as zones where at the family level, the household level, you cannot say that these people are rural or urban. That they still grow rice, but then maybe the son gets on a motorbike in the morning and goes to work in the city, or a bus comes by and picks up the daughter and takes her to work in a factory making computer chips, or one or another of the parents has a small business that they've started. It's very much a mix economically, and he was struck by how the language we use, well, there's a hegemony in the world of concepts coming from the rich world going to describe phenomena in the rest of the world. He saw this as a particular form of settlement that was neither rural nor urban, and it was very much, he was in a sense discovering, or he was personally becoming aware of this on the island of Java. So he felt if someone is going to write about this, it should have a name from Java. So that's why the desakota. What was interesting is some geographers in China read his work, and he started getting invitations to come to China to talk about the desakota in China, because these regional geographers were looking at exactly the same phenomenon. And I think there are parallels also in India. Territories with high rural densities that can, where a company can come in and a foreign investor and say, I'm going to build a factory and I need cheap labor. Where's the best place to locate? It's not in the city. It's way out in the countryside, because the people already they're growing rice. They don't need, well, this is the capitalist speaking. They don't need good wages, because they're already living very cheaply. So you can avoid the high prices of the urban economy by locating far out into the countryside. You also don't have to worry about pollution controls, because that's a very urban thing. So you go out into the far countryside in Java, and you'll see factories that are making textiles, and the colors of water will be running in the streams are colors not found in nature. So I think there are forms of settlement that are neither urban or rural by our conventional standards, and we need new terminology for this.
It's okay. Pásale el micrófono.
Sorry. I think that somebody from India presented and he coined this term like ruralopolis. Le estoy diciendo que un académico de la India acuñó este término que se llama ruralopolis y que trata de explicar pero pues lo mismo como en Indonesia, ¿no? Los desacotas. Thank you, Michael. Nice.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Yo sí tengo una. I have a question. And it's about because you mentioned it during your presentation, and it's also related with the presentation of Gustavo Garza during the morning, and about the economic base of the city. Because you said, well, we cannot longer like to be thinking in the industrial city and the paradigm because the growth of the industry, now it's not like it will be necessary for every city to have an industrial base for the growth, and now the different cities that we know are like more thinking in a service economy or a quaternary economy. But I was thinking also with the presentation of Saskia Sassen a couple of days here at Colmex, and she was talking about the specialized differences between cities, and that ultimately some elements of infrastructure make the difference between some cities with others, and that the specialization of these infrastructures are like the key element to understand why some cities are, I don't know if developed, but that some cities are like with an economic vocation different to other cities. So I was thinking also about this quaternary idea and the knowledge economy. Is it possible for all the cities to be thinking into build a knowledge economy and a creative class or a different kind of services for the future instead of the industrial city? Or should we thinking in this kind of the Dakota with a little industrial base? Or what do you think? How do you envision this kind of future thinking in these new paradigms of the knowledge economy and so on?
Another easy question. A lot of people are thinking about this, and I think this is influencing policy in a number of places. I think there's, well, for one thing, what I had described as the modernist paradigm, I think includes this idea of starting with industrialization and going up from secondary production to tertiary to the knowledge economy. And sort of following on from that in a policy sense is the idea of leapfrogging, that you can avoid the worst of an industrial economy by promoting a knowledge economy or a service economy. I think a lot of strategies of development that are trying to be more environmentally friendly or more inclusive are attempting to do that, not necessarily all that well. For one thing about the point about the infrastructure and the knowledge economy, I think is something that, well, Malaysia and Singapore are both very keen on that. In Malaysia's case, they've been building the multimedia super corridor is the term for this territory running south from the capital city of Kuala Lumpur, which is, there are various parts to it with names like Cyberjaya, as a way to, a place that is meant to attract not only the production facilities of the companies like Microsoft and so forth, but their research and development facilities, and to use that as a way of promoting startups within the Malaysian business community. There are different ways of judging its success, but I think for the most part it tends to be like a maquiladora kind of situation more than a really innovative approach so far. The creative class view is even more complex. I think it's led to a number of sort of strange. In the case of Singapore, which is a quite authoritarian society in some ways. They know that the creative class needs bohemian districts, so they've started designating particular parts of the city for as bohemian districts to attract the creative class. I don't think anyone has too much faith in that.
No.
So I would have loved to see Saskia Sassen's talk on what the infrastructure is that underlies different strategies of development. But just to summarize this very complex issue that you've raised, you're bringing up let's say a policy issue or a normative, and it's a normative question that you've asked, how to get from
Yes.
From A to B. And there are people and places that are attempting to do that, but at the same time, there is the so-called informal sector, or there is the informal economy would be a better term for it, which is it certainly isn't a sector, but it's a hugely complex question as to how it functions. Does it consist? Can one look at it in a systematic way, as a systemic entity, or is it sort of a leftover from? I think one could talk about ways of theorizing and analyzing the informal economy for a few hours. When I was a grad student at Berkeley, we had the grad students organized a course actually, and we spent 2 semesters talking about the informal economy. This was back in the 1980s, and I think there's even more to talk about now, because I think the informal economy I might define as that which isn't fully encompassed in the capitalist economy. That is, that it includes the non-capitalist market economy as well as self-provisioning. I think this is an area that I think needs a lot of attention, not for the sake of a normative approach per se, but for the sake of simply understanding how people are going to live in the city of the future as a starting point, and from that work toward thinking about policy and planning approaches. So that doesn't answer your question, but
a little bit, yes. Thank you. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? La doctora Stenger.
I would like to know if your studies in the Asian region, your studies were focusing some countries of the Asian region. Can you make some conclusions? Can't you take some conclusions from those national studies concerning the whole Asian region to compare it with the process of urbanization, for instance, in Latin America? Because these 2 regions are very different, because in Latin America, the process of urbanization was much earlier,
right.
much earlier in a different context, with not only the process of migrations, but also the process of creation of jobs in our countries, and the creation of jobs in those Asian countries. I think that made a big difference. I don't know how the situation is nowadays, but some years ago that made a big difference, because the creation of jobs was much higher in those countries, and so you didn't have those mass of unemployed people, of sub-employed people that made part of the poverty of our countries. So the presence of poverty in those Asian countries and the process of creation of jobs, I think, was different. And so how do you think you can speak about the peripheral capitalism, that maybe you can speak about 2 different kinds of peripheral capitalisms in Asia and in Latin America, no? And 2 different contexts. Is it possible, because I think you know something about Latin America, and is it possible to make some comparisons between these 2 regions concerning this aspects I am
Right.
talking about. Because you said something important in your presentation, is that planning cities is not possible, not only in our cities, but also in those cities. They have something in common, that it has to do with the presence of capitalism, it has to do with, I don't know,
Yeah.
So some things are, you can say that they are similar, although the context of the process of urbanization, creation of jobs, migrations, are different.
Okay, this is another very big question. I think there are two or three questions that are very important that you've asked in this one single question. So, but first, turning to the question of the comparison between Asia and Latin America. When I'm in Asia, and I mentioned if Latin America comes up, the people will often make the comparison as if Latin America, all of Latin America, urbanized the same way. And they'll talk about, oh, well, China is different from Vietnam, and which is different. Within Asia, there's tremendous differences. And when I'm in Latin America, people will talk about Asia as if it's one form of urbanization. I think in reality, both of these huge regions have so much diversity. Just as an example, what I know of Latin America is what I read as a grad student in the 1980s, I should say. But even then, it was very instructive. One book that sticks with me is a book by Alan Gilbert and Peter Ward comparing three cities: Valencia, which is the Valencia in Venezuela, with Bogota and Mexico City, I think, are the three cities. And simply the question of how people occupy land is tremendously different. You have the pirate subdividers of Bogota who own the land and are selling it, which is very different from land invasion, as in Valencia, which is different again from the Ejido lands in Mexico. And one can make the same point in Asia, that land and other processes of urbanization differ quite a bit from country to country. In fact, I've been, every time when I talk to people who work on urbanization and urban studies in China, one of the phenomena about urbanization in China is around the control of rural lands, that they have a system in place that I think is very similar to the Ejido lands in Mexico, at least how it was constituted in the 1970s and 80s. I always push people who work on urbanization in China to read the Mexican literature and possibly think of a comparative study between Mexico and China. So I think in some ways, Mexico in the 1980s might be more like China now than China is like India now, for example. The sorts of diversity in both regions is tremendous. But that said, I think there is a difference in the overall timing of the urban transition, that Latin America has started urbanizing much earlier, and I don't know why. Actually, in preparing for coming here, I sent an email to John Friedman asking this question: why is Latin America much more urban than Asia or Africa? And he said, he wrote back saying he has no idea. Well, so maybe this is a question for people who study cities in Latin America. And why is the urbanization process so much further advanced? And what's odd about it to me is that the explanation in the Asian context of why urbanization is delayed, that is because of colonialism and the effects of World War I and World War II, you'll read how the Depression and World Wars slowed down urbanization in Asia, whereas when I've looked trying to find the answer in Latin America, I read, well, the effect of World War II was to accelerate urbanization. So war has different effects in different places, I guess. But I think it's because of the nature of how different national economies connected in the period during the World Wars. So I think the complex issue of national comparisons, one has to be very careful about making assumptions about regions. And I do think anyone who is interested in China, who works on Mexico, could have a fantastic comparative research study. The question about job creation, though, is equally complex. I think one point that is maybe simplistic point one could make is how the urbanization process in Asia happened at a time when when there was more foreign direct investment, more money flowing through globalization than when Mexico or when Latin America was at a similar stage of 50% urban. The international capital was not nearly as prevalent by any means. It was there's so much money moving around the world and dropping down into various places to build factories now than when Mexico was 50% urban. That was about 1950 or so.
More or less a little bit later, yeah.
And Indonesia and China and Vietnam are all at about the 50% stage. So I think I'm not an economist. This is just brainstorming but I think something about the implications for wages and the attraction of foreign direct investment and so forth probably has. I think it's a timing issue more than anything. That why the job creation seems to be so. And it's not all of Asia. I think there's also quite a bit of variation. China is famous as the factory to the world right now because of foreign capital, whereas other countries are famous for sending their labor overseas because they don't get the investment. The Philippines, for example, or Bangladesh, which are Asian countries without the foreign investment to the same degree as China or Vietnam. So.
Bueno, entonces, para concluir, Michael, no me resta más que darte las gracias. Thank you very much for being here with us and for letting us having you. And here is a diploma for you for your presentation. Thank you very much. Y muchas gracias al doctor Michael Leaf. Un aplauso, por favor.